Hello, my name is Lori Moriarty. I worked for over 10 years as part of the guiding service in Kilkenny Castle for the OPW, and I currently work for the library service in Laois. As part of Kilkenny Castle's commitment to marking pride and to celebrating and examining the stories of the Irish LGBTQ plus community, I'm going to be talking to you today about the Ladies of Llangollen. So hopefully technology is going to be on my side right now. Brilliant. Before we do look at their lives in a little more depth, however, I do feel that it's important to just outline the frame I'm going to give the talk with today. I think it's hugely important to acknowledge the immense and lasting cultural position that the ladies occupied at the time and to today, while celebrated and, of course, also examined during their own lives. More recently, again, the ladies have come under some scrutiny, especially in the media. The biting urge when it comes to the ladies of Llangollen seems to be to categorise their lives. So far, the drive has been to label them as either a perfect example of the romantic ideal of friendship, and by romantic here I'm referring to the philosophical and literary and political movement at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. So, on one hand, you have the urge to label them as the perfect example of a chaste romantic friendship. And then on the other hand, we have, as you can see from some of the headlines in the slide behind me there, um, this urge to out them as Ireland's first lesbians or only, or I should say, first openly gay couple. And I think the issue here is that in a bid to recover the history of these women and to learn more about their lives, who they were and how they lived, we can fall into an assumption which the gender and sexuality theorist Jack Halberstam has drawn attention to, that when it comes to kind of historical female same sex groups, we kind of use lesbianism as this umbrella term, and we just kind of put them all under this umbrella term of lesbianism. And of course, in labeling these women, the ladies of Llangollen, as lesbians, we deny them other possibilities. And essentially and ultimately, barring new sources coming to light, we cannot strictly label the lives of these women. We do not know if they consummated their relationship. And so, what is helpful here is that if we consider their lives, as I propose and as other people have proposed before me, if we consider their lives through a queer lens, in seeing Eleanor Butler, and Sarah Ponsonby, the ladies of Llangollen, as establishing their life and a way of life at odds with the ideas of legitimate or normative sexuality, we can come to view their relationship as queer without endlessly getting into this argument over whether or not they themselves were sexually intimate, or what way did they explore or um, live their sexuality during their lifetimes. And this is an idea that was talked about by Fiona Brideoak in her work on the ladies more recently. Um, what we do know for certain about Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby was that they did create a way of life which you could consider as largely performative. Whether consciously or not, they made use of a very specific cultural moment, and they chose a way of life which would have been idealized by poets and artists and philosophers. And it was this, combined with their class and who their families were, which enabled them to live a life external to normative heterosexuality. Yet, even as their romantic seclusion would have been immortalized in verse by poets such as Wordsworth, at the same time, they were faced with very real life issues like financial problems and illness and family arguments, rumors, local disputes, and also their own farming enterprise. All of these would have featured as a part of their daily lives. Their days as well would have involved extensive reading and scholarship and writing. They would have kept journals and they were avid letter writers. Um, and as well as all of that, and despite their attempt to create a life of rustic seclusion, their house would have become a tourist spot during their lifetime. It was a tourist spot to both the literary elite, as well as to upper and middle class travellers who actually would have broken their journey to London at Llangollen, especially Irish visitors on the way to London. They would have stopped at Llangollen and visited the women. So, in short, really, nothing about the lives of these women is easily labeled or categorized. They are nothing. Nothing about them is black and white. And most importantly, and most, I suppose, the strongest example of this would have been the way in which they started their journey towards living together. For those who are not familiar with the ladies of Llangollen at all, they were two Irish women of aristocratic birth. Eleanor Butler was the daughter of Walter Butler of Kilcashin-Garry-Ricken. He would have become the 16th Earl of Ormond, the Earl of Ossory, and the Viscount Thurles. And her mother was Eleanor Morris. The Butler family were considered as being one of the first families in the Irish aristocracy, an extremely well connected family. And you can find out a lot more about that family and their history online, and of course, through books from your local library. And even you can go visit Kilkenny Castle and Ormond Castle as well. But Sarah Ponsonby, then, on the other hand, she was the daughter of Shaumbra Brabazon Ponsonby and Louisa Lyons. And again, the Ponsonby family were an extremely well connected Irish aristocratic family. But by the age of 7, Sarah found herself in quite a precarious state because she would have been orphaned, and eventually she was placed under the care of her father's cousin, Lady Betty of Woodstock. Lady Betty decided to send Sarah to be educated at Park's boarding school in Kilkenny, and it was during her time there that she and Eleanor would have first become acquainted. Sarah would have been around 13, and Eleanor would have been 29. And you can see in the slide behind me just an image of Woodstock House where Sarah would have lived for a time. And a sketch of Kilkenny Castle, which can be found in the book, The Ormond Picture Collection, um, from around 1810. So it just gives you an idea of what those houses would have looked, houses, castles would have looked like while the ladies lived there. Um, Over the next 10 years, they would have maintained contact, and it seems that it's during this period that they actually developed a plan to live together. According to letters copied and presented by Caroline Hamilton, Lady Betty's husband, William, had in some way at some point offended Sarah. And it's commonly just assumed that Sir William would have propositioned Sarah at some point to become his next wife. Lady Betty would have suffered from ill health at various points in her lifetime, and it was seen that Sir William was just lining up her replacement. Sarah, of course, took offence, and in the slide behind me, you can read an excerpt from a letter she would have sent to a family friend, Miss Goddard. And included in the excerpt there is the note that she sent Sir William. And you can see from the language there, like she's quite a self-possessed young woman. She knows her own mind, and she's quite, as I said, self-possessed there. Sarah's niece, Caroline, also alludes in her own reminiscences that there would have been, at the same time, a secret correspondence between Sarah and the equally unhappy Eleanor. And it's this kind of moment with Sir William, which is often used as a determining factor in stories of the lady's escape. The stories do, of course, also circulate of the many proposals that would have been made for Eleanor's hand in marriage, but when it comes down to it, details on these are always extremely vague. So whether it was love or friendship or necessity, it was in 1778 that the 23-year-old Sarah and 39-year-old Eleanor made their first attempt at freedom. I will just mention at this point as well that Eleanor would have been sent by her family to be educated at a convent in France. And when she came home, she remained unmarried. So she was in also in quite a precarious state, social position. Um, there was talk of sending her back to the convent, which would have been a practice amongst kind of aristocratic Catholic families, um, where they could kind of support and pay very little to support their unmarried daughters in convents in France. Um, so, I mean, there's a lot of circumstances at play here, but essentially what it boils down to is that on the evening of March 30th, Sarah Ponsonby dresses in men's clothes. She arms herself with a pistol and she brings her dog Frisk. She climbs out the parlour window of Woodstock House and she was led by a labourer to a barn where Eleanor Butler was waiting for her. Eleanor, on her end, had crept out of the castle as the family went into dinner, so it was quite a while before she was noticed as missing. Seemingly, she changed into men's clothing on the parade just outside the castle and then rode the 16 miles to meet Sarah. Eventually, however, both women were actually found in a barn near Waterford, having passed the night in the barn after failing to catch the English packet or the ship to England. Eleanor would have been escorted by a family friend and her brother in law, Morgan Kavanagh, to Boris House at this point, while Lady Betty took the now ill Sarah back to Woodstock. Sarah, it seems, took a bad cold after spending the night in the barn. What's really interesting here is that despite the upset caused to both the families, and you can see here in a letter from Lady Betty to again the same family friend, Miss Goddard, how upset and shocked they were. We are in the utmost distress. Um, Despite this upset, there does seem to be this really, at I suppose, at this remove from the happenings, um, almost comical relief, because it was seen, and sorry, that's just an image of Boris House where Eleanor would have been sent. There is an air of relief about the whole escapade as no man was involved in the scheme. And you can see this in some of the letters that were sent by the family in Woodstock. So again, Lady Betty to Mrs. Goddard notes that in the coach I could not help asking her the cause of this sudden flight, and she said it was not sudden. Their plan was to go to England, take a house, and live together. By all accounts, though, there was no man concerned with either of them. This was of the utmost importance. And again, later, Mrs. Tighe to again Miss Goddard reiterates this point. There were no gentlemen concerned, nor does it appear to be anything more than a scheme of romantic friendship. So there is an air of respectability about it all. It seems as though, while in disgrace with their respective families, the ladies were saved from serious social condemnation by the lack of this male involvement. So their virtue was maintained, and both ladies then enter into this period of isolation. At this point, they were prevented from seeing each other. So Eleanor remained at Boris, and the Butler family, meantime, her parents cut communication with her, and it was understood that they were trying to decide really what they were going to do with her. And in Woodstock, Sarah took to her bed and kept to her room. Whatever the wider social view of their actions at this time, it is obvious that their families, at least on the Woodstock side, and in particular through the personage of this family friend, Miss Goddard, Mrs. Goddard, um, they were not immune to Sarah being in a sense of some kind of unspecified danger from Eleanor's influence. Um, it is important, I suppose, to remember that in this situation, Sarah is the younger um, person, and it would have been hoped that she herself would make a good marriage. So that could be the source of this kind of wariness, which surrounds kind of their approach to Eleanor and Eleanor's influence. But you can see Mrs. Goddard, she obviously goes to Woodstock and confronts Sarah. I spoke not to dissuade her from her purpose, but to discharge my conscience of the duty I owed her as a friend by letting her know my opinion of Miss Butler and the certainty I had that they would never agree living together. I spoke of her with harshness and freedom, said she had a debauched mind, no ingredients for friendship that ought to be founded on virtue. So it's quite heavy-handed, um, and it's quite loaded. That term, a debauched mind. It's very strong language there. But despite obviously these attempts to change their minds, uh, both women remain true to their goal. Sarah's resolution seems to be strengthened by the news that the Butler family are going to send Eleanor to live in a convent in France. As I said, this would have been a common practice in upper class families as a way of supporting unmarried daughters at very little cost. She maintains and she writes in letters to Miss Goddard that she would do anything to save Eleanor from popery, from Catholicism, and a convent. By April 22nd, the Journal of Mrs. Goddard notes that Eleanor at some point escaped from Boris House and travelled 12 miles to Woodstock to be hidden in Sarah's room for 2 days, aided by the housemaid Mary Carryl. So Eleanor breaks out of Boris House and makes her way to Woodstock and is hidden in Sarah's room. At this juncture, of course, it becomes obvious that the Butlers are more concerned with Eleanor giving up the friendship with Sarah than with her staying out of the way in a convent. So they just want this all to be over. But despite this, and for some kind of unspecified reason, Walter Butler suddenly relents and one day just sends his lawyer, Mr. Park, to Woodstock to offer some provision for the ladies in their new life together. With this move, the Woodstock contingent on Sarah's side, they have no hope of dissuading the women. And on a bright morning in May, the two women, later accompanied by Mary Carroll, the servant who would have helped them, entered the butler coach and left for Waterford. On the 9th of May, then, they left Ireland and they actually never returned. So, May 1778 marks the first journal Sarah keeps of her life with Eleanor. It's entitled, and it's a brilliant title, and an account of a journey in Wales performed in May 1778 by two fugitive ladies, dedicated to her most tenderly beloved companion. Travelling throughout Wales, the ladies eventually settled on the area of Llangollen, but it wasn't actually until 1780 that they first negotiated the lease on a cottage which they renamed as Plas Newydd. It had 5 rooms and 4 acres, and their rent would have been £11, 7 shillings, and sixpence at that point in time. The financial situation of the ladies is something that always comes up in talk of them, because they would have been dependent on their families and the goodwill of their families for income. Initially, they could rely on around £280 annually, and while to some this would seem a princely amount, the women struggled and continued to struggle financially because they seemed to be not great at managing their money. So they seemed to veer between attempts at frugality and then wildly expensive improvements to their house and garden. And I think John Kerwin has some really interesting information about the financial well-being, as they say, of the women. Um, the, their lives do seem to follow this pattern. So they get loans from friends, they're awarded pensions, but there are delays in the paying of the pensions. They are promised money, some money doesn't show up for them. So even though they have enough money, there's always a steady sense of kind of insecurity about it, and it does trouble the women over the years. This is countered then by their pursuit in farming. So over their 48 years at Newydd, the women built a small but very secure farm, and by 1800 it would have had 9 acres and 4 cows. The haymaking dinner arranged by Mary Carroll for that year hosted 14 labourers and cost nearly £1. By 1802, as I mentioned, John Kerwin notes, the ladies would have had an assured, though irregularly paid, annual income of £430, at which point their annual rent of the cottage and farmland would have been £22 a year. Um, so it just seems to be one of those things. They do have enough money, but they aren't great at managing it. So despite this kind of financial situation, these ladies always seemed to draw people to them. And part of their plan in living as they did involved this romantic ideal of living in rustic seclusion, never staying away from their home longer than a day, which they did in fact travel from their home and spend the night in other places, um, avoiding fashionable society, and also dedicating themselves to the improvement of their mind and their surroundings. And I think it's a testament to them that this dedication to their surroundings has survived even to this day. So you can go visit their house and their gardens in Wales, and you can also see the kind of how the house has changed over the years through pictures of and sketches of the house. One of them actually done by Sarah Ponsonby herself. So they were continually adding on and altering the cottage and making it quite ornamental, and they did this to the gardens as well. You can also see that this progression from just kind of personal and private sketches to kind of how would you say, almost kind of tourist mementos of the ladies. So this is an engraving in 1850. This is a watercolor by a visitor in 1835. You can see it on the right hand side there of the slide. Compared to a photo of the garden today, you can see it's relatively unchanged. And again, this quite kind of ornamental, slightly gothic feel to the garden design. Um, so they dedicated to themselves to their place, also, as I said, to their scholarship and writing. You can see here a list of books which would have been read by the ladies between April and June in 1789. So it's a 3 month period, and it does look astounding in different languages, but really it wouldn't have been too unusual for ladies of their education and interests at that time. And also, as I mentioned, while rustic seclusion was an aim for them or a wish for them and part of their philosophy of life. Uh, Llangollen was a town which would have been quite busy. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, it was a place where people broke their journey from Holyhead to London. And so, even though they didn't enter into fashionable society, it often came to them. The ladies also would have issued invitations to those visitors of interest to them or connection to them. While on the other hand, then sometimes we also get stories of Eleanor Butler hiding behind the curtains in the study and looking out at tourists in their garden and wishing they were gone. So it's a real, I suppose, juxtaposition of images that we get of the women. Talk about, of course, the ladies never really settled down. They did quickly become part of village life, but they also became a ready attraction for, as I mentioned, many illustrious and not so illustrious visitors. So you can see poor Eleanor here laments their situation. When shall we be quite alone? Um, but this is a list then of some of the visitors to them. You can see a lot of famous romantic figures. Lord Byron, Caroline Lamb, Duke of Wellington, Percy Shelley, the Wordsworths, very well connected people. Melusina Trench, the author, would have visited them. Anna Seward wrote about the ladies. Um, the publisher, John Murray, extremely famous publisher, the Princess of Wales. So a lot of very well connected people would have visited to them. And of course, they would have been related to very well connected and famous figures as well. Sarah would have been related to Mary Tighe, the poetess, who actually sent the women one of the first versions of her famous Psyche and Other Poems, her poetry collection. And the copy that she sent the women would have included some extra stanzas and also would have been personalized by some drawings as well. So, I mean, um, they were an extremely well connected couple. And of course, had the ladies actually entertained any thoughts of relative anonymity in their neighborhood. This actually would have been completely dashed by an article printed in the St. James Chronicle in the July of 1790. And I think it's probably hard for us to comprehend how upsetting this was to the ladies at the time. So you can see the title, even the title itself is quite heavy handed: Extraordinary Female Affection. The article here, there's some quite long excerpts in this slide and the next. So if you want to pause and have a read of those yourself. The article essentially it rehashes the events of the ladies' escape from Ireland, but also quite shockingly, it gives quite precise details of their financial arrangements. So this was printed, and as soon as this comes out in early July, another virtually identical report was published in the General Evening Post for the 20th, 22nd of July, again in 1790. And then the same report is published again in the London Chronicle for the same time period, 20th to the 22nd of July, except that the names were shortened in the London Chronicle to Miss B and Miss P. While suspicions for the authorship of the article um, lay with a disgruntled local inn owner who would have been in a dispute with the ladies over the use of carriages, bringing visitors from the town to visit the women. The ladies did have a circle of friends and correspondents that they could appeal to in order to do some damage control. The ladies also appealed to Edmund Burke for his help at this point in time. Sorry, we're having uh, some technical difficulties. Edmund Burke, of course, like an extremely famous figure at this point in time, a very well known Irish statesman, politician. And you can see from his reply to Eleanor Butler's letter, basically he says he can't do much for her, but that all her friends know and how virtuous both women were and are, and how they are something to aspire to. So he tends to kind of soothe her feelings in the letter, but there's nothing concrete he can do really to help them. And it's moments like this, I feel, in their lives which really brings home the truth of their situation. Essentially, it's their name and their family and their class and the style of life in which they live, this romantic style of life. It protects them, it allows them to live a different way, but it also will ever draw attention to them. And I mean, even to this day, though, at the same time, there are those that believe this idea of the ladies of lovers is in some way an anachronistic theory, that we're just reading too much into it. However, from the moment Mrs. Goddard uses the word debauched to describe Eleanor, to the very heavy handed title of the newspaper article, the ladies are being outed, whether deservedly or not, by these people. And while such evidence of this sense of suspicion which surrounds the ladies, I mean, it has been glossed over in several works about the women. And to some extent, I even include Elizabeth Mavor's work here. More recent studies have unearthed documentary evidence which goes to support the idea that the acquaintances of the ladies suspected that they were more than chaste ideals of friendship that they would have presented themselves as. And in particular, here, I want to draw your attention to two visitors to the ladies at their home, the famous Anne Lister and also Mrs. Piozzi, who would have been known as Mrs. Thrale at one point in her life. Anne Lister, to many people, won't need any introduction. She was an extremely famous landowner and adventurer who lived an openly gay lifestyle and was known to many as Gentleman Jack or Fred. Her coded diaries contained frank details of her relationships and flirtations with women. Anne visits the ladies in 1882 and immediately doubts the nature of their relationship, as you can see from her letter to her partner. Their own close neighbour and friend, Mrs. Piozzi, would have been an extremely famous diarist and a friend of Samuel Johnson. She wrote very strongly on her feelings about sapphism, so women who love women. And she termed the women, the ladies of Llangollen, damned saphists, saying that many literary women would not spend a night under their roof unless accompanied by a man. So it's a strange kind of turn of events in the lives of the ladies. Um, it's, as a side note, I suppose it is interesting to note that successive dogs in Plasnewydd were all christened Sappho as well. Um, and of course, at this time, there were fears around Sapphism, um, which many, like Mrs. Piozzi, would have deemed as almost criminal. But at this time as well, it's important to note it was only male homosexuality that was often prosecuted against. For women who loved women, it was just not the same. And this is never more clear than in a court case which took place in 1811, where two female school teachers were accused of an unnatural relationship by a pupil's relative, and the teachers were awarded damages. So, at the end of the court case, the judge noted that they could not be convicted or accused of a crime which did not exist. And I think this really just leads us to the crux of the matter, because for queer women, their history and past is so obscure and ghost-like. Their lives were not possible, and so in turn did not exist. For the past 40 or 50 years, and again with awakened interest in women's history, past lives are being revised with modern eyes. But what complicates all of this, again, is the fact that the gay culture of the 18th century could be considered completely different to uh, the gay culture of today. So some of the behavior which today we would deem as sexual could have been termed as chaste or permissible between friends at that time. So this all kind of complicates things. And also, I think I would be lying if I didn't admit that figures such as Anne Lister, with her desire to live as out a life as possible and who viewed sexuality as a vital part of her identity, um, and it's these things which make her so much more clearly relatable and familiar to us. Um, we can identify far easier with Anne Lister than with the Ladies of Llangollen, and it's her diaries also throw the textual chasteness of the ladies into this stark relief. So they will document their days, but we don't know of their feelings. We don't get a lot of depth there. We do get some, but we don't get a lot. And while for so many the ladies' relationship was that of, as I said, a chaste friendship, the fact was that they also became a symbol to some of their contemporaries of the possibility of a lasting queer community. And I think this is something that cannot be disputed either. This argument gains support when we look at how gay figures such as Anne Lister again, and also the poet Anna Seward, looked to the ladies of Llangollen and their lifestyle as the embodiment of hope for a lasting relationship where both Anne Lister and Anna Seward had previously failed to achieve. And I think Anne Lister in the end is successful, but she uses the ladies of Llangollen, and Anna Seward also seems to do this as this kind of beacon of hope to them that they can achieve this. Again, it's Fiona Brideoak's work here on the ladies in this regard, which is very convincing. As is her exploration of the kind of contentious position the ladies held in literary history at the time, which we won't have a chance to explore fully here today. The ladies lived together and slept together in the same bed. Supposedly, they also had a private walk in their garden where they could argue without being overheard. From the time of their leaving Ireland until Eleanor's death, it seems that they were never apart. Their choice to live as they did was bold, yet it was not technically an anomaly. Women of their education and rank had more opportunities to create the lives they wanted. Some of their contemporaries lauded their friendship, yet also viewed them with a degree of suspicion. Amongst their friends, passionate female relationships featured. Ladies such as Anne Lister and Anna Seward were independent enough to out their own lives. Today, as during their lifetime, we still wonder about the ladies, just as Anne Lister did on her visit to them. By now, though, in some ways, the ladies have become caricatures of themselves, and I include in this some of the newer headlines about the ladies, where they're kind of proclaimed as being the first openly gay couple in Ireland, which, of course, denies any other openly gay couples that might have been living before or during their lives. So I think I would include some of the press coverage in this. But you can see this most clearly, I think, in the images that we have of the women, which are quite interesting. So the ladies famously made it known that they didn't want to sit for portraits or paintings. So we have quite few actual, like, original sketches of the women. This is the very famous library sketch, which was supposedly taken unbeknownst to the women. Um, so essentially, what we have is one or two original sketches, and then we have people just take them and reimagine them and remake them and sell them as almost like tourist memorabilia. But you can see this, that they almost become that that one's quite nice. But they almost become kind of caricatures of themselves. So this is a lithograph version from the 1830s. This is a print then, which is a complete reimagining of the original library sketch. This one has them outdoors. This is another imagining of them wearing their famous riding habits. And this is another aspect to the ladies, which I won't have time to go into today, is the fashion, the signaling that they take part in. So they visitors to the ladies often make fun of them for how they're dressed, which is seen as quite a outmoded and rustic. So they're always in these kind of long riding habits, quite loose garments. Also sometimes seen as wearing kind of top hats, but there is argument that the top hats they were wearing were actually versions of the Welsh hat. Um, I just quickly, what's really interesting about this is that it is noted in John Kerwin's edited version of Caroline Hamilton's Reminiscences that Sarah Ponsonby, before she left Ireland, packed away her clothes and donned this habit and was wearing a habit for several days before they left Ireland. So I think it's quite kind of symbolic maybe as well of their new way of life. Um, but again, sorry. But you can see some of the tourist kind of memorabilia then that would have come out of the ladies and their lives. So you could buy your Ladies of Llangollen figurines and jugs and earthenware. Um, More lately then the sculptures by Katie Scarlett Howard, which were unveiled in 2010 at Plasnewydd, to a bit of kind of consternation and criticism. But they are another take on the Ladies of Llangollen. And I suppose essentially historians still work on the ladies, still hope to uncover more diaries and letters by the women, and even as this work is done, their story seems to be being retold in ever more broad and general terms. There are books now which feature interviews with the ghosts of the ladies. There are plays which present them as nascent suffragettes or feminists. Even recently, there are documentaries calling them, as I mentioned, Ireland's first openly gay couple, which ignores other gay lives and ignores, I think, as well, many of the subtleties of the historical moment that the ladies were born out of. Many of these, and even this talk today, also give very little time to the curious figure of Mary Carroll, who would have helped them on their initial journey and during all their elopements. She was their housekeeper. Supposedly, they kept around four servants but referred to them as family. Mary Carroll was very interestingly never paid for her service. She was constantly being mentioned in their diaries, and she also left them land on her death. Um, she seems like a absolutely just really interesting character or person, I should say. Um, when the ladies initially left Ireland, Mary Carroll was removed from her post in Woodstock. It was said that she had caused grievous damage to another servant by throwing a candlestick, and she was sent back home to her home in New Ross. In New Ross, she was known by the nickname Moll the Bruiser. And when the ladies heard that she had lost her position, they asked her to come and live with them in Wales. So she went to Wales and lived with them, and she was seen as quite a kind of tough masculine presence in the house and almost like a protective figure in the house as well. But she does hold this really interesting position in the household, and it would just be amazing to find out more about Mary Carroll as well. Um, and I know that even as I'm giving out about um, kind of media reporting on the ladies of Llangollen and recent documentaries on them, um, and just kind of, I suppose, marking out the shortfalls of this move to almost mythologize the ladies of Llangollen. I have to also say that it's this kind of natural curiosity over the women, and also the urge, which I'm giving out about as well, to categorize them. This grants them a legacy that is denied others. So, no matter how many times their story is reshaped or retold, they're never forgotten. Today, you can still go see their home, you can see their garden, and you can see the place where they are buried. Mary Carroll would have died in 1809, and it was decided at that point that there would come a time when all three women were buried together. In 1810, this beautiful three-sided Gothic monument surrounded by railings was placed over the grave in St. Colin's churchyard in Llangollen. Eleanor died in 1829. Sarah died a few years later in 1831, having never been apart in 51 years. So it is quite a beautiful testament to their relationship. And I will just finish the talk at this point, quoting this poem on the ladies of Llangollen. Now, as I said, there are poems about the ladies by Wordsworth, by Anna Seward, but this one by Mrs. Grant, I think, just ends in quite a lovely way. While ambition exults in her storm-beaten dome, like the tower on your mountain that frowns o'er your home, with tranquil seclusion and friendship your lot, how blessed, how secure, how envied your cot. It's just quite a beautiful image to end with this evening. And I know I've hit on so many things, the ladies, what they wore, their position in the literary movement of the time, and we've barely really got to explore that. But I hope I've done a good job in bringing the story of the ladies and giving it a bit more context as well, because I think that's quite important that we just understand or try to understand the time they lived in and how kind of complicated it is and how complex it is. I think sometimes we can look back on the Romantic period and just kind of see it in these kind of broad generalizations and just Lord Byron swooning around the place and cavorting. But it was quite a complex period of time. And I think in looking at the lives of the ladies, you get it just adds so much more color to our understanding of that time period as well. At this point, I would like to thank John Kerwin, as always, because whenever I email, he answers. He's just a brilliant help, and his excellent work on the reminiscences of Mary and Caroline Hamilton. I've noted some of the other sources that I've used here in this last slide. But if anyone wants more in-depth bibliography of works I've referred to, do feel free to contact me at that email address. And also, if anyone has any questions or would like to talk about this further, do feel free to email me as well. I'd like to thank Kilkenny Castle for asking me to put the talk together this evening or today, whenever you're watching it. And I'd like to thank everyone once more for their time and attention. Thank you very much.